Great, thanks so much, Vicky, and welcome to everyone here for a lovely Tuesday afternoon to run through everything that is recognised development expenditure. First DFAT ACFID webinar for the year, so good to start with the best, I guess. As Vicky said, my name's Rosemary Welsh and I work in the operations section of the ANCP team, and with me I have Jeff Simkis.
Good afternoon, everyone. I see a number of familiar names on the list, so many of you might know me from either accreditation or the previous RDE desk reviews, or if you've been lucky enough to undergo a RDE Spot Check, which we'll cover a little bit later on. Yeah. So look forward to an open session. Please feel free to ask any questions as we go through. We'll cover off a little bit on for new people as we go through, and also what's new around the RDE.
For 2020, yeah. And just before we get into it, just want to say there has been a slight delay in uploading the 2020 version of the RDE explanatory notes to the DFAT website. So I've emailed out a copy to the ANCP contacts 1 and 2, as well as the finance contact. But if for some reason you haven't got it or you just need it again, please feel free just to email the ANCP at dfat.gov.au inbox, and we'll be happy to share them out, as there's just been a delay getting them onto the DFAT website.
Of course, those notes are not really useful for you in doing your current RDE submission as of the 31st of March, because that would have been based on your prior year's financial statements, either December or June, but they will be important for December year end. You would have already used last year's or any June year end coming up.
Yeah. Those notes, they'll just go through some of the changes to the Smarty grants, to the ANCP online form though. So if you're just kind of looking for that guidance, they'll be helpful there, but we're also going to run through that today. Here we go. Okay, so just to quickly go through what we're going to cover today. So as we were just talking about the RDE explanatory notes, please make sure that you've read them, as a lot of what we're going through today is obviously backed up by the explanatory notes. So first of all, we're going to run through what is recognised development expenditure, so the principles and what's eligible and what's not. Then we're going to go through the actual RDE worksheet and how to submit that through ANCP online. Then Jeff's going to quickly run through some common errors that occur when NGOs submit their RDE. And then we'll go through the RDE spot checks, what's involved in that, and then finish off on where to get advice. So we can see from the list of registrations here that we've got some accredited NGOs, also NGOs that aren't accredited, but also within the NGOs that are accredited, we might have some new faces, new people doing RDE for the first time. So the webinar today will be pitched at that base level of, what it is and how to do everything. So we thought we might just start off to quickly let everyone know, I guess if you are an experienced RDE, processor or whatever you'd like to say, just to let you know what's changed or what's new for 2020. So I guess the first major one is that there are 3 updates to the ANCP online form itself. So I guess if you've, these were in the email that was sent out to let you know that the RDE round was open, but just to quickly run through, when you first open the form, there'll be a question as to whether this is your first RDE submission since gaining accreditation, or whether, and so you'll just answer that yes or no. The second one is there's now a spot for you to put your 2 previous years total RDE, and essentially this has been added in just so, I guess, first of all, for a check for the NGOs to check whether this year's submission is looking relatively the same as to previous year, and also as a help to Jeff when he's going through to seeing if and why your RDE has significantly changed from the previous 2 years.
I think there's a subtle difference as well, Rosemary, in that previously there was a separate round created for each year, for each RDE year. So for this year, you actually go into your 2019. If you previously submitted, you go into your last year's submission and click on that, and then you have the option to add a new form for 2020.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, so that just at the high level, we'll go through that kind of in more detail when we get further along. But yeah, that is correct. And then the last change to the form is that we're now just the authorising officer for RDE submissions needs to be the person who is listed as the NGO recipient in your 1920 grant agreement. So more often than not, this is the CEO. But if you're unsure of that, we just ask you to check your grant agreement to see who's listed there. Then so aside from the changes to the worksheet, I guess the next two were changes from last year's, but again, still relevant to this year. So we've in the RDE notes, they've got the medical rates included now, which hopefully you've used from last year for this year's submission. And there's also just that new methodology of calculating the hourly rates of volunteers, which again was introduced last year, and we hope you've used it for this year's submission. Okay,
so that does mean if anyone who is comfortable with their previous RDE submissions and feel that there's no major or significant change, then you can feel free to drop out now if you want. But otherwise, we'll sort of continue on with the at a sort of more lower level and more detail as to how to do it.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so as we've just been saying, in terms of the actual technical RDE notes, there's been no updates from 2019, which should hopefully be, and we hope that the changes implemented in the form are just end up being easier for you guys as well as for us. But so basically just to run through the principle of RDE. So you can see here, Recognised Development Expenditure is the annual eligible expenditure of an NGO using contributions from the Australian community. So basically you can see there we've got the words eligible expenditure bolded, as it has to be money that your NGO has expensed. It can't be the income or the revenue or anything like that. It's the expenditure. As well from the Australian community. So, you know, not government funding, not foreign donations, purely from the Australian community. And then eligible expenditure is for the NGO's own development and humanitarian activities overseas and development education in Australia. And as you can see here, we've got eligible contributions include donations of cash, gifts in kind, and volunteer services. So basically your RDE can be both cash as well as non-cash, but the amount of in-kind, gifts in kind or volunteer cannot exceed your cash. So just a key point to note there that, yeah, that can't happen.
So you may have a much larger non-cash component, but the eligible amount, and there's a spot on the worksheet where you'll need to reduce that to the maximum of your cash RDE.
Yeah, correct. Okay, so just to run through why we, why do we collect RDE? So basically there are two reasons. The first one is to determine your eligibility for accreditation to be in the ANCP. So as you would know, NGOs that are accredited at base level require an RDE of 50,000 averaged over 3 years, and NGOs that are accredited at full level need an RDE of 100,000 averaged over 3 years. The second reason is so we can calculate, so for the full NGOs, it's how we calculate the annual ANCP grant amount for your NGO in line with the ANCP funding policy. And as you would be aware, base NGOs receive 150,000 a year. So second reason there doesn't apply to the base NGOs, but it is for full. Just a reminder, if you wanted to actually look at the ANCP funding policy, that policy is up on the DFAT website, and there's also a link to it at the end of this presentation if you can't find it when you're searching. Just to also be clear that RDE does not assess the financial viability of an NGO, and it doesn't provide an indication of the effectiveness of an NGO. So it's purely a financial figure that tells us the amount of funds raised from the Australian community and expended on legitimate development activities. Okay. So NGOs' RDE submissions have to be must be from your audited financial statements. So I guess, you know, it's good to see why we use NGOs' audited financial statements. I'm just going to pause here just before we go on. We've just had a question come through that's asked, how does it work when you go from lower to upper level funding in terms of, I guess, moving from base accreditation from full accreditation? So what happens is when an NGO applies to be for an upgrade to go from base accreditation to full, that is when the NGO's RDE is then used to calculate their annual grant amount. So if an NGO was at base, the amount of the annual grant amount is 150 each year. Doesn't matter how much your RDE fluctuates, but when you move up to be into full level, it's when your RDE is then used to calculate your grant amount. If you came into the program straight at full level, so you didn't apply for a base, you just went straight to full, the first year your annual grant amount is capped at 300,000, and then subsequent years is then used your RDE. But when you move from base to full, that first cap of 300 doesn't apply. Okay. So hopefully that addresses that question there. So just going back to why we use the audited financial statements. So firstly, it gives us confidence as your audited financial statements have been checked and signed off by an independent and appropriately qualified person. It should also accurately reflect the agency's true financial situation and compliance with the ACFID Code of Conduct. It provides greater transparency and consistency, which, as we've just spoken about, is essential as RDE is what's used to calculate the full level NGO's annual grant amount. And yeah, as we were saying, the amounts in the RDE worksheet must accurately reflect what's in your audited financial statements. And if you don't have, if there is a discrepancy between your audited financial statements and what's submitted in your RDE submission, you then must accompany the discrepancy with some kind of evidence as to why the adjustment has occurred.
A couple of comments. There's a question there as well regarding submitting your RDE based on your financial statements. So yes, you should your RDE will usually be submitted based on your last audited financial statements. So for most organisations, that will either be a December year end or the previous June's year end. So obviously for June year end this year, they're not going to be finished in time for any RDE submission. So it's last year, it'll be 2019, June 2019 financial statements that you will be using. If you were a new organisation this year and you submitted an RDE and you've reached a base or a full level of accreditation, it may be that you may have to submit your RDE, the same RDE that you would have previously done as part of your new application. For those that are December year end, if there is any risk that your audited statements are not going to be available by the 31st of March or very close to that date, then you may have to use the previous year's financial statements. There are some NGOs that actually use that. The other thing I just wanted to clarify, obviously all figures don't come directly out of the financial statements. As Rosemary said, most of them, or a number of them, will be taken from the financial statement figures and potentially adjusted for. There's no, whilst income is shown in relation to grants from DFAT, the actual expenditure for a DFAT grant is not always shown, so that will be a calculated figure based on your records, which is why we always encourage submitting your reconciliation worksheets as part of the process, so that I can see how and where the figures have been based.
Yeah, and it's definitely, so that spot in the form is mandatory, but it also just saves both Jeff and the NGO with some back and forth, because he won't have to then contact you to kind of figure out, you know, why that discrepancy was there. If it's all in the submission, Jeff can cruise through and check everything as needed, hopefully.
It's a lot easier. And it's easier to confirm that you've deducted administration of your DFAT grant, etc.
Yeah.
Which we'll cover later.
Okay, so just to run through quickly the calculation method for RDE. So as you can see here, it is itself, looking at it, essentially quite a straightforward method. So in the form, first when you go through, you'll enter your eligible disbursements. Then you'll enter in your deductions. Then the system will generate your total cash by subtracting your deductions from your eligible disbursements. Then you'll go through and you'll enter in your non-cash, so your gifts in kind and your volunteer services. Then the system will add your total cash RDE and your non-cash RDE to get your total figure, just noting that your non-cash component can't exceed your cash.
Yeah, and that figure needs to be manually entered into. Unfortunately, the Smarty Grant system can't calculate that.
Yep. But again, we can highlight that as we move through where that spot in the form is. But then once you've done that, yep, the system will populate your total RDE figure. Just to get into the details of RDE submissions. So each year they're due 31 March. So this year that is 5 p.m. Tuesday, the 31st of March. Generally we like to tell and advise NGOs maybe just to aim for one day earlier, or at least a couple of hours earlier, just to allow for any hurdles that might happen unexpectedly. You know, if it's a technical difficulty, or anything that happens, because unfortunately extensions for this, for your RDE submission are not possible. So all accredited NGOs are required to submit your RDE submission. So it's actually the third and final milestone in your 1920 ANCP grant agreement. Early submissions are welcome, and we can see that we've had a few, so maybe four NGOs that have submitted their RDE. So thanks to those NGOs who have got them in earlier. Yeah, and just to kind of give some reasons, so extensions aren't possible for your RDE submissions as we're working towards a tight deadline between when, in terms of the time that Jeff has to go through all 57 submissions to verify them in the lead up to budget night, to when we know when the ANCP allocation has been handed down, and then to get your annual, so your 2021 figure, then to generate your grant agreements by 30 June 2020. So please get in touch with us if you think there is a reason as to why you, if you won't be able to do it by 31st of March, as we'll just need to work with you to make sure we have it before that date. Just also to highlight here, so we've got the link up to the online, the ANCP online application. As Jeff kind of touched on before, this year there is a slight change as to how you go in and access your 2020 form. So previously it's been that each year has had its own, I guess what we would call round in the ANCP online. This year, because of some of the changes that have happened on the back end, this year what's happened is we're now creating, instead of a new round, we're creating new forms that will run off your 2019 submission. So initially when you click that link, there will be a message that tells you that the 2019 round has closed. But to get past that, all you need to do is actually log in. And once you've logged in, you'll be able to see a spot for your 2020 submission. So please get in touch if you can't see where the 2020 form is, but just remember to please actually log in first, otherwise you will see an error message.
Yeah, and I think after you log in, you will still need to click on your 2019 submission.
There should be a link to the 2021. But yeah, if there's not, please just let us know. But we hope that everyone's managed to find that.
Well, at least 4 people have so far.
Yeah. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through the rationale, the principles behind RDE, we'll jump into the actual RDE submission in ANCP online. So as you can see here, there's a spot for you to log in. And as we said, please make sure you log in here to make sure you can access your form. Also, just a reminder, when you are logging in, if you are for some reason creating a new login for your NGO, that your name as well as your organisation should be the NGO. If you put your name in when registering, unfortunately, all of your NGO submissions from now on will be listed under your personal name and not your organisation. So this one here is a bit of a system limitation that we can't get around. So we just ask that both under the your name section and the organisation, that it's both the NGO if you are registering for the first time. So once you've logged in, hopefully the first sections here are pretty straightforward. But here you'll type in the name of your NGO, as well as which
is where you actually put the financial year that you're basing your RDE on. So I usually So for this year, it'll be 31st of December 2019 or the 30th of June 2019. And in some cases, it may be the 31st of December 2018, for those that have long audit lead times.
Yes.
And it won't be finished by 31 March.
Yep. So then following that, you would select your accreditation type, so whether it's base or full. And then this question following that here is the first change that we have to the actual ANCP online form. So this one here is just asking, is this your first RDE submission after gaining a DFAT accreditation? So just to be clear here that this is purely your, if it's whether it's your first accreditation first submission after gaining accreditation. So it does not apply to re-accreditations. So only a very select few will be answering yes to this question if it's their first RDE submission. But for the majority of NGOs, you'll be answering no, as you will have done previous RDE submissions. Okay, so moving on into the actual financial RDE submission. So the first section here is your eligible disbursements. So as you can see, there's 3 sections to complete. 1A, which is funds to international programs, which is drawn from your audited financial statements. Then 1B, the program support costs, again, which is drawn from your AFS. And then section 2, which is community education.
Which also is normally reported in AFS or your ACRED format financial statements.
Yes. And so just to cover off here, so eligible community education includes costs of producing and distributing. No, I can't say that word. Materials and conducting educational meetings. So these costs are often included in marketing or fundraising costs of many NGOs. And unless they're actually separated out in your audited financial statements, you can't include it in your RDE. So please make sure, I guess this year it's too late, but future, that is how your AFS is presented.
Yeah, and so this is one of the reasons why we require some figures from the audited financial statements. So there's a rigor around the process for actually checking those, and that's conducted as part of the external audit.
Yep. And then so for section 3 here, as said earlier, the form is going to tally up 1A, 1B and 2 to give you your total eligible disbursements. So now looking at deductions. So I guess any figures that are not from the Australian community. So just going back again, so linking with that point. So the principle of RDE is the annual eligible expenditure of each NGO using contributions from the Australian community. So here we're going to take out, as you can see, any funding that you've got from DFAT. So this figure from DFAT should include all funding that you have. So for some NGOs, it might just be your ANCP grant amount. For other NGOs, this may also include other funding that you receive from the department. So just make sure here that that is the total figure.
So there's a question from Jess around what do you mean by conservative approach to calculating community education? So that just means when you're actually calculating the community education expense, in most cases, for example, the production of your annual report and production of any marketing brochures and marketing material have a dual purpose around an education to your supporters, financial supporters in the community around your projects and around development issues. and also often for a fundraising purpose. So when we talk about having just a more reasonable conservative approach, it means if you were calculating 90% of your annual report cost as community education and 10%, as marketing fundraising, and look, annual report is probably not marketing fundraising, but certainly other brochures. Annual report is accountability governance, so you certainly can use an element of your annual report. What we're saying is, don't have too high estimate of calculations. Take a conservative approach. So that might be a sort of 20 to 40% for annual report, other marketing brochures. It's really coming up with your own approach and methodology around how you calculate that community education cost, and that it's a reasonable conservative approach. The question, is there required limits or ratios for the eligible disbursements? No, there's no specific. So those eligible disbursements should come. So eligible disbursements is a figure that's in your audited financial statements under the ACFID format. So there are definitions around the eligible disbursements, and it's basically any funds that are actually sent overseas. So that is a starting position from which we then take out funds that have come from either other sources, non-allowed sources, or funds that are ineligible, which we'll talk about next.
So we've just got one final, I guess just in this lot, one final question that's asking whether the DFAT income needs to include the rollover amount.
So again, so RDE is always based on expenditure. So if you rolled over DFAT income from a prior year and expended it in the current year's financial statements that you're using for your RDE calculation, then yes, you would include that. So that's why we're always looking at that DFAT reconciliation as part of the RDE calculation. So how do most NGOs? Another question. That's good. Keep the questions coming. It's the sort of thing as we go through that prompt responses, and we'll try to address most of them as we get through. So how do most NGOs manage the separation and accounting of their development, non-development expenditure to projects? So in some cases, donors require separate bank accounts, but most don't these days. So the way most NGOs manage that is through their general ledger system. So they'll have different categories that are either project-related expenses, and obviously different NGOs based on the size have different complexity of ledgers, from Sun and Aggresso systems down to sort of the old ACPAC and Xero, but most are able to sort of segregate their projects and use some sort of coding to actually identify those non-development expenditure projects, which are then taken out at potentially a number of different spots in the actual worksheet. Yep.
Okay, so we've gotten through all those questions that have come through. So we'll jump back in to the worksheet where we're looking at section 4 of the deductions. So moving on to 4B. So here's whether you've received any other Australian government departments or accredited NGO funding. So this is both Australian Commonwealth or state government departments, as this is classified or represents government funding. It's any institutions where the original source of the funding was the Australian government, or any other accredited NGOs where the source, of course, was DFAT, as they would be claiming that in their own RDE. And then 4C is anything from overseas. So as we said before, it is the Australian community. So if you've received any foreign donations, this needs to be specified here in this section. So now Section 5 is looking at ineligible disbursements. So these are part of expenditure that doesn't relate to eligible activities, which are defined in the RDE explanatory notes. So here we can see section 5A is looking at any welfare, religious and political activities. So religious activities are defined as supporting or promoting a particular religion, including activities undertaken with the intention of converting individuals or groups from one faith and or denomination to another. Activities that build up religious structures, including infrastructure, training or organisational activities, are also ineligible for RDE inclusion, unless those structures are specifically designed to provide a non-denominational development or relief assistance. I'll finish off these ones here and then we'll answer a question. So political activities are defined as supporting a political party, candidate or organisation affiliated to a political party, and also include activities in support of separatist movements. So this brings the RDE definition in line with the ANCP manual. Again, so we encourage you just to check the RDE explanatory notes if you're unsure. And then finally, just to cover off on welfare. So welfare are those activities designed to maintain beneficiaries in a certain state. So no long-term development or no clear sustainable outcome for the communities or beneficiaries. So all of those three ineligible activities are listed in section 5A.
And in some cases, Rosemary, we do have a number of NGOs who have a process where they go through with their development program people and the finance people and review their projects. And there are some elements of some projects that may have a welfare component. For example, some of the sponsorship type funds received can have might have a specific gift element, and that's usually taken out as part of welfare. For some of the religious affiliation agencies, there might be a small component that's used from a education or a Christian or a religious education component, and that's often sort of taken out of the project. So as long as the main core of the project is from a development perspective, and there can be an incidental sort of welfare component, and we just have a process around how we estimate and sort of calculate that. Back to Anna's question around, there's a question around funding from overseas. So there's a source of overseas funds. So how far back do we have to trace those funds? So do we need to clarify if the sources of funding from our supporter is from overseas? So that's a good question. Sometimes that's obvious and sometimes it's not. So normally that comes out of your donor database and sort of websites, and it may not always be obvious, potentially if it's certainly anonymous donations, but if you have donor databases and you actually have the details of supporters, obviously those supporters that are overseas, it's a lot more obvious. Others may not be as obvious, but normally we're talking about the more significant donations that might be from foundations or grant foundations, other agencies, USAID or Gates Foundation, etc. Any of those type of donations are clearly, obviously, from overseas. Individual supporters as well can be from overseas and give quite large donations. If there's a number of small supporters and you're not always sure where they came from, then honestly, I wouldn't get too sort of fussed about it. It's more to cater for a significant sort of overseas funding component based on the principles of RDE being from the Australian community. Yeah. And there are plenty of overseas supporters who are in Australia and donating, and that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, and then so just jumping back into the form. So 5B1 and 5B2, so these are the channeled funds or international alliances, networks or consortiums. So these are those disbursements that your NGO has no direct control or oversight as to how these funds are spent. So I guess we're saying it a lot, but this is RDE eligible items are your NGO's own development activities. So you must have control or oversight as to how the money is spent for RDE inclusion. So 5C here is funds sent to international alliances, networks or consortiums for administration, fundraising, or promotion of the organisation. So this includes administration costs for overseas country offices, which you'll need to list here as a deduction following your probable inclusion at line 1A in your eligible disbursements. So if you're in doubt as to whether the activity is eligible or not, please either ask us, either DFAT or Jeff. Our contact details are on the last slide, or do please err on the side of caution. You know, we've kind of discussed those reasons previously as to why we ask that.
That's a question.
Yeah.
So there's a question from Andrew, which is back to the around the source of the funds in relation to potentially 4C overseas. So the questions around what about Australian subsidiaries of international corporations. So and look, obviously that's a good question, and it's certainly a finer line. If it's a arm's length transaction from an Australian subsidiary of an international organisation, and there are many of those, then that's perfectly fine. If it's more of a contrived nature, where an international organisation donates to the Australian organisation for the sole purpose of them donating to the NGO, then obviously that's the sort of thing that should be excluded. We like to think that doesn't really happen, but I have seen some cases where it's sort of the nature, and sometimes that just can be around a funding arrangement. Another question from Amy around 5B2. So could you please confirm that this is a deduction for wages paid to overseas employees delivering our programs who are not Australian? No, that's not the case. So if you're paying wages to overseas employees delivering programs, then that would be under 1A, funds to international programs. Unless you were paying the wages in Australia first and then they were going overseas, but where it might be under program support. But normally if you're sending money overseas to pay for overseas employees, then that's fine. Yeah. So 5B2 is really only in respect to where the type of fund, so you might be paying money, but the type of funds that you actually is for alliances, or it could be sort of marketing support or other programs that are essentially ineligible. In some cases, there are components of programs under sort of the global program, what used to be referred to as the global program criteria, and where the element of control is not essentially maintained by the Australian NGO, and there might be funding into a large program and they don't have any visibility or control. Programs are often taken out under 5B2.
And we've just got another question here that's relating to 5C. So what if the admin costs to overseas office directly or indirectly relate to eligible project costs?
Yeah, so if they're eligible project costs, then ideally you should try to put them and classify them as 1A expenditure. Obviously, if you are classifying things as administration, and it stands out as administration. So there are some guidelines in the ANCP grant guidelines around administration.
In the manual, yeah.
In the manual. And this is a fine line between what's eligible administration, because technically administration office or costs for overseas offices are part of your 10% grant allowance for from your DFAT allowance under your ANCP funds. And so if they are standard admin costs, i.e. might be rental, etc., for your larger sort of country office, if they're more of a administrative admin cost for like project field offices, then that's the type of thing that is sort of more allowable, and ideally better to categorise them as project support costs rather than calling them admin costs.
Okay, and then so again, just jumping back into the form. So once you've entered in sections 4 and 5, the ANCP online will then do the maths, and it'll give you your total deduction figure here. And then, so this next section here, this is then going to calculate your total cash RDE, so your eligible disbursements minus your total deductions. So again, the system here is going to do that maths for you.
So another question from Andrew around employees who are paid in Australia but based full-time overseas delivering programs. So yeah, so that expenditure probably goes, depending on how you classify that might go under program support. So for actual or it's funds to international programs. So whether they're paid in Australian dollars or paid actually into an Australian bank account, but if they're working overseas, then yeah, that'll either be 1A or 1B, and certainly allowable expenditure if they're delivering on eligible development programs.
Okay, so now here we're moving into the non-cash RDE component. So it's your gifts in kind and volunteer services. So just a reminder that your non-cash RDE must be recorded in your AFS to be eligible for inclusion. So if it's not in your AFS, unfortunately, you can't include it in your submission. So if it's not, it might be something that you want to look at and address for future years, so that you're not selling yourself short.
Yeah, so I'll come back and make a comment on that regarding the non-cash component. It's just a question regarding a percentage of program support that that you need to live with. And look, no, there's not. Many agencies have different funding models depending on how they work. There's a large number of volunteer agencies who are paying most of their costs in Australian dollars as well, so they're not sending as much money to overseas partners. So they have a sort of much smaller funds to international programs and much bigger program support. So it's all relevant for the specific programs.
Yeah.
In respect to the gift in kind, I just wanted to comment that this is one of the areas, it is important that it's in the financial, audited financial statements. So that's one of the areas that actually occasionally sort of cropped up, but also, and it can be in the financial statements in two ways, either directly as a figure in the audited financial statements in the income statement, and so it will usually go in there as an income and expenditure line, or it can be included in a note. And so many NGOs just put it in the note. But so when you're putting it in the note, you'll need to put the relevant amount, and you should also put an indication around how it's actually valued, so the basis of valuation. And then often we'll touch on later around the support. I think we specifically asked for support in the format of Excel spreadsheets or something as to how those figures are actually calculated.
Yeah.
There are many NGOs who include the full value of their financial, also their volunteer services as a non-cash item, but sometimes obviously only half of those or a certain component of those might be eligible.
Yep.
So they'll have the full amount in the financial statements, and they may or may not specifically disclose the eligible component in their financial statements. That's fine, as long as they submit sort of working papers indicating how that reconciles back to the financial statements and demonstrating the eligible and non-eligible component, i.e., and that's often marketing or fundraising volunteers.
Yeah.
So if a gift in kind is for a free service used in Australia by employees, can it be claimed under this section? So the answer to that is unfortunately no. The rules around gifts in kind are that they're required to be sent overseas. It's a little bit of sort of old-fashioned definition back in the days when we were sending lots of blankets and food and other items overseas. There are some services that are donated and can be essentially sort of sent overseas. Sometimes that's freight services or airfares, etc., and others, but it's still a requirement currently under the RDE guidelines that gifts in kind need to be sent overseas. So any donations for training or for hotels in Australia, legal services, pro bono, that's all fantastic community and corporate support, but it can't be included as a gift in kind under your RDE submission.
So we've also got another question here that says, what about donated assets that are depreciated?
Yep. So if they're a donated asset, if they're sent overseas, then they are probably no longer included on your books if they're actually given to a client, or given to a specific project, because they sort of have to be sent overseas. So in the case of this particular NGO, it might be medical equipment that would be sent overseas, or it might be taken overseas and brought back. You might be able to actually then look at sort of the calculation around the depreciation being an allowable gift in kind. It's a little bit more of a specific ruling, and we'll have to investigate that further, I think, Jess. Might take that one offline. We always have to be careful about setting too many precedents.
And so also another question here that's popped up, can Australian-based staff monitoring costs claim as RDE?
So certainly, if you're Australian staff going overseas and monitoring your projects, and that wasn't a DFAT funded DME component, because if it was DFAT funded, obviously it would come out as a deduction under 4A as DFAT funds. But if it's Australian funds and they're going overseas monitoring that, that's eligible, project expenditure, normally categorised under program support as part of monitoring.
Yep.
So you certainly, yes.
Yep. Okay, and just to also touch on here, we touched on it a bit at the beginning, but so the RDE explanatory notes have revised hourly rates for calculating the value of volunteer hours, which include new rates for medical rates, which, as we said, were included in 2019. When you're valuing your volunteer services. We understand that some of the volunteers might be receiving a higher salary than what's listed in the RDE explanatory notes. However, they must be valued at what is in the explanatory notes so that all NGOs are using the same rates. So you can't simply assign a higher rate to a volunteer because they're a specialist and they would potentially get paid more in Australia. The rate of pay are provided so that basically there's consistency between all NGOs.
So there's a question from Karen around the valuation of volunteer services, around do we have to use the rates provided or can we use the salary structure of the organisation? So, so two things in relation to that. One, so yeah, the short answer is yes, you do have to use the volunteer rates. So to the salary structure of the organisation, I'm not entirely sure exactly what you mean by that, because if they were getting paid by the organisation, then they're not a volunteer. So a volunteer is somebody who is not paid by the organisation. When Rosemary was referring to that they might have a higher salary, that's obviously if they're working elsewhere, often a lot of medical practitioners, yep. And therefore they volunteer their services. So that's one of the reasons we put some medical rates in there. The rates that are actually included in the RDE guidelines actually come out of the DFAT award. Yep. The DFAT award is based on a 3-year period. So you'll see when you look at the rates, they came in, it normally has the start and the end, it has a range. Ideally, you might pick a starting point, a midpoint and an end point over the next 3 years. Not everyone does that, but those rates do apply for the next 3 years until the next updated DFAT award change. So those rates are based solely on DFAT awards, and that's why they only change every 3 years. So the rates, yes, the rates, medical rates were actually introduced in last year's RDE guidelines, so the 2019, and that's why they would be or could be eligible for inclusion in this year's stat accounts. Yep. As well, but they only came out in last year, so yeah, they only came out in March, so unless you use them in your 30 June financial statements for 2019, then you wouldn't be able to use them until the 30 June 2020 financial statements. Yeah. That depends on whether you were on the ball and looking at last year's updated RDE guidelines.
Okay. So jumping back in, I guess, to the form. So yeah, 8 is the value of your eligible gifts in kind. 9 is the value of your volunteer services. So then line 10, it's going to calculate here your total non-cash RDE component. So this is where here in section or in line 11, you can see we've got your eligible non-cash RDE. So as we said before, up to half of your RDE can be from eligible gifts in kind or volunteer services. So this is where in line 11, you're going to need to manually enter in a figure. So if your non-cash component here shown at line 10 is greater than your total cash, in line 11 you must enter the your total cash RDE, so what is found in line 7 of your submission. If your non-cash RDE listed in line 10 is less than your cash RDE, what you'll do then is re-enter the figure calculated at line 10 here in line 11.
Just before you go on, Rosemary, there was a previous question before, and I suppose I'd just like to make a clarification. Often there's a subtle sort of difference between the volunteer services and the approach around gifts in kind, particularly where that gift in kind is a service that's actually been performed by a person. And so if it's a gift in kind, and we had some examples where some NGOs have claimed gifts in kind for work that is conducted overseas, remembering as part of the definition it needs to be sent overseas. So if a consultant has conducted a piece of work overseas and either donated their time to actually do that, and you have some record and evaluation to support that may be based on their normal rates and an estimate of the time that it would have taken, then potentially that could be an eligible sort of gift in kind. This is one of the reasons why we require you to put it in your financial statements, so that any calculation is reviewed by the auditors and signed off on the basis of a reasonable approach around the quantification and valuation on that. So there are some NGOs that have used employees of another organisation and treated that as gifts in kind, and applied salaries for that. So because they're not volunteers to the organisation, there's actually been a donated gift, but that donated gift of the service essentially has to be a service that's being sent overseas. So that's a little bit more tricky, and needs to be some detailed sort of records around that. Good question around a volunteer from AVI, EWB is eligible. So
Australian Volunteers,
so
International and Engineers Without Borders. Yeah.
And if they're a volunteer of EWB, then, for example, so they're a volunteer of EWB, but AVI might be funding the per diems of that organisation, then I think you argue that it's probably allowable for EWB. This is certainly something that has increased a little bit sort of maybe over the last year. I haven't seen a lot of it sort of previously, and I won't necessarily always know where the volunteers or the nature of who's paying for those. Volunteers are allowed to be paid a per diem allowance. They just can't be paid from the organisation. So if they're still an eligible volunteer, then I think that's fine. Yep. Currently, AVI are not an accredited agency, yep. And so they wouldn't be claiming the volunteers as part of any of their RDE calculation. That may change at a point in time, but I think even AVI, their volunteers are under a DFAT funded volunteer program anyway. So it is an interesting point, but I think the volunteer is always the usually of the Australian NGO. If EWB had sourced the volunteer, it's their volunteer, and AVI is just providing funding, then I think that's sort of perfectly valid.
Yeah.
There's another question around Habitat for Humanity. What's the basis for not permitting non-cash RDE to be greater than cash RDE? The reason being is there are a large number of organisations that have a lot of volunteers and have significant non-cash component, and that would sort of unfairly skew funding. So the mechanism is always the funding raised from the Australian community, and so it's important that there's that cash component to match a non-cash component as well.
Yep. Thanks, Jeff.
That's been the historical reason. There's no reason why that can't change in the future, but it's currently the rules for this submission.
Yep. Okay, so we'll just keep moving along here. This section here is, I guess, probably one of the most, well, not important, but just it's a change that has been from last year to this year. So just up on the screen, we've got both options as to whether you're a new NGO applying, that's doing an RDE submission for the first year since accreditation, or whether you're just an existing NGO that's continuing. But basically that question that you answer at the beginning of the form is going to remove one of these questions here. So you'll only have one when you're doing your submission. But here we're looking for your total RDE figure for the previous 2 years. So for 2019 and for 2018. So for the majority of you who have a submission for last year, your 2019 total RDE figure is going to be populated in the cell there as the system is able to recognise
the prior year
submission. However, you will need to enter in your 2018 figure manually because this year's form isn't linked to the 2018 submission. As we move forward, if we keep this structure, the system will be able to populate it, but just this first year that we've introduced this system, you will have to manually enter in your 2018 figure. And just for the few NGOs where it is your first RDE submission, both figures here, so for 2018 and 2019, you'll need to manually populate that total figure here yourself.
And that would be based on the previous RDEs you submitted to DFAT as part of your application.
Yes, correct. Yep. Then section 12 here remains the same as last year. So basically the system here is going to calculate your total RDE component, so your total cash as well as your total non-cash. What is new here as well is the additional comments box sitting beneath line 12. So here we're looking if there has been a significant variation between this year's total RDE figure compared to the previous 2 years. We're just wanting a, I guess, brief but clear summary as to why there was a variation to your total RDE figure.
Yeah, and that can happen for a number of reasons: increase in funding, or significant sort of reduction in funding and less funds sent overseas. But it's more a process to go back and do a reasonable analysis of what are the almost at a line by line level, as to look at what's changed significantly. And I think for many NGOs it might help pick up some of the errors that have occurred on the submissions, as far as something that wasn't deducted or was included in previous years and hasn't been in the current year, particularly when people change as far as who's submitting the most recent worksheet. So it doesn't have to be a major detailed explanation, but a reasonable effort around what are the significant reasons for the reduction or increase in your overall RDE.
Yep, that's right. And there is now also an additional comments box at the very end of the form. So previously we just used to have one, and we asked if you could please put any further details that related to your submission. So just to note that this comment box here only relates to changes to your previous RDE. So just hold off on putting in any of those comments until we get to the end of the form. So we've got a question here that says, is there a definition for a significant variation?
You can always go by the ANCP definition of
20%. So
it's 15 to 20%, or yep. I think it's more a considered response around, obviously your RDE is not going to be exactly the same.
Yeah.
There's significant sort of changes in all of the variables, but it's more a considered response around what's changed over the prior 2 years. Particularly, this is something that I will look at as part of the desk review process, and if there are significant variations, and then that's relative to the individual RDE. So if a organisation has an RDE of 100,000 and it suddenly jumped up to 300,000 in the current year, that's a significant variation for me. If they have a RDE of 5 million and it's increased by 500,000, that's 10%. It's not as significant. So it's hard to come up with a straight percentage because it's relative.
Yep.
But it should be relative to your own organisation based on your previous RDEs. I think when you look at it, it'll seem sort of reasonably obvious. Also, if there's been a significant up or down and then back up again, might want to look at sort of and just explain some reasons, and just to make sure that I can see that there has been a considered response and process around the preparation of RDE, and there's not anything obvious that may have been left off or it should have been taken off, like a overseas funding or ineligible project, which sometimes is the case.
Okay, so the kind of final stages of the form here. So basically this section here is where you upload your annual financial statements as well as your annual report. So you can do that here in two ways. So you can either provide us with a website link or you can attach the report itself. So either is fine, you know, totally acceptable, just whichever is easiest for you.
Yeah, please make sure the website links work though. So
Yes.
I have had some website links and then find that the annual reports are not actually attached there.
Yeah. Yes.
Yet. Yeah. That is a common way of hiding the fact that the annual report is not yet finalised.
Yeah. Okay, and then so this section here is this spot that Jeff and myself have been referring to about attaching additional documentation. As we can see here, this section in the form is mandatory. So if there is any thing that it requires this here, that from your audited financial statements, this is the spot where we need you to upload, you know, as to why there are changes. So I guess previously we've had a few NGOs that have certified that there's no requirement to upload additional documentation. However, this has been incorrect. So please, we ask you just to pay attention to this and upload documentation if it's required.
And look, it's really just to clarify where you've got significant or differences in figures that are included in the audited financial statements to the figures that you've included in your RDE calculation, then it's useful to actually submit your Excel RDE work paper and reconciliation. So look, probably 50% of the NGOs actually submit a detailed reconciliation, and for the majority of those, I can work through the process they've undergone, and unless I've got any specific queries, it's a lot less likely to have any queries and have to sort of follow them up. For those that don't submit anything, I then can't always tell whether administration has been taken off the DFAT calculation because there may be prior year's figures that have been rolled over and spent in the current year, and so it's not always clear. And so I usually then have to go back and ask the question around what's the difference, and how that sort of reconciles. So it's in your interest. Most organisations are using an RDE Excel spreadsheet to actually get to their calculation before they actually submit it. So it's just good practice to actually submit that as part of the working papers, and also to submit working papers around sort of any detailed volunteer services or gifting kind calculations. So one question around the annual reports for the whole organisation, not just Australia. Our finances, obviously AFS for Australia alone. Should we still upload the annual report? Look, yes, still upload it, depending on whether in the annual report you include an ACFID format or whether the ACFID format is just in the audited financial statements. I often look at the annual report to get an idea around programs and other areas of information as well. So it's not just always the financials that I'm looking at. I'm sometimes using that to look at and understand an organisation that I don't know, who I may not have come across before or had a lot to deal with. So I'm just looking at information in there that's useful for me as part of the RDE assessment.
All right. So the next section here on the contact details and authorization. So here in the contact details is where we want the information as to who the organisation's, I guess, most relevant finance officer is. So if you just jump down to the bottom of the page here, you can see here is where the additional comments box is. So this is where, for example, if the person that prepared the RDE submission, whose contact details are listed here, if they're going to be away in April, when Jeff needs to contact them if he has any questions on your submission, please provide alternate contact details here in the additional comments section.
Or indicate the time that you're away, because that obviously Easter is in April, and each state has different school holidays, so many people are often away. So if you let me know the times that you're not available, I can try to make sure I do your RDE review prior to you going away, or after you come back as well. So obviously it's hard to manage everybody, but if you're away for a big chunk of time, that's useful. Nothing worse than when I finally get to your review and then find there's nobody there for a couple of weeks. So, or alternatively, provide another contact as well with some email details.
Yeah. And I guess anything as well, if you feel relates to your RDE submission that, hasn't been covered off, just pop it in here, as Jeff will see that when he's going through.
Yeah, so there have been some organisations that their annual reports or audited financial statements are in the final stages of sort of being signed off, but may not be final as at the 31st of March. So we have had those organisations usually contact DFAT and the ANCP section to advise them of that, and then we'll submit a draft financial statements as part of their RDE calculation, and then sort of ideally follow up very quickly sort of after the date with the actual final financial statements. But they also can provide information in the additional comments as to when the board meeting is that they're approving the AFS.
Yeah. Okay, and then the section here on authorisation. So you'll see that there's a link here for organisations to get the certification template. So this has been updated since last year, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the update here has been that the certification form now needs to be signed by your NGO recipient representative that is listed in your 1920 grant agreement. So more often than not, this is the CEO. It could be someone different, but just commonly it is the CEO. And this change has been brought in this year. As we've mentioned before, RDE is what's used to calculate fully accredited NGOs annual grant amount. So we are just looking that this submission has been signed off by the person listed in your grant agreement, as it is important. We've got a question here that says, if the CEO has since been changed and not listed, I guess, as the recipient in your grant agreement, can the new CEO sign and declare? So the answer is yes. So if that also, I guess, if that person has changed, we would have hoped that you had notified us so that we could have amended those details on our system here.
We're about to notify.
Yeah, so please let us know, I guess, if there are any changes to that. But ultimately, yes, it has to be signed off by the person who is, or who would be the head of the organisation that's listed in your grant agreement. So please ensure that that's there. Also, as this is a change from last year, we just ask that NGOs factor this into the timeline when you're preparing your submission. It might just take a few, extra days or something to get it through your CEO, as it would last year. So as we said before, extensions aren't possible for RDE, so they are due on the 31st of March. So please just factor this in when you're thinking about timelines. Okay, so now I guess Maybe we've covered some of these, maybe we haven't, but Jeff will just run through some of the common errors and issues that he sees when he goes through the RDE submissions.
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. So, look, we've probably covered a few of those. And certainly, the top one was around making sure that you use the organisation name rather than the username. There's nothing worse than I'm trying to find a particular NGO and it's under Alice or it's under Jess instead of the organisation's name. So always makes that a little bit hard, and I think that then stays there forever as well, which is a bit annoying for yourself as well. Also indicated that the RDE figures are not always traceable to audited financial statements. So as you said, in your income or source of income notes, it will often give me an indication of the DFAT grants, whether there's overseas grants or other Australian, but that's actually obviously the income side, not necessarily the appropriate expenditure deduction. So it will usually be a different figure, but if it's significantly different and there's no work papers submitted, makes it hard for me to confirm whether or not administration's been deducted from DFAT, whether the right figure or all overseas grants have been deducted. And obviously, sometimes those overseas grants are in relation to marketing or administrative expenditure, so therefore wouldn't have been included in RD in the first place and wasn't too appropriate to deduct them. But without any explanations or any reconciliations, it's hard for me to determine, and it'll normally generate a question to the representative. Again, touched on the fact whether the AFS are drafts. So from my perspective, obviously it's not ideal to be auditing back to drafts because I then have to do it 2 or 3 times. But appreciate sometimes these things are sort of being finalised, and audit as a process does take a point in time. So please make sure they're as late as you can, and then if they do change, then you'll need to communicate directly with me around what's changed and the specific nature of the changes. Potentially sort of submit an updated form, RD form. One of the changes I made last year with Smarty Grants is that I have the ability to reopen an application as well, so that does make it easier for me to actually address any errors. One of the other common issues was around that volunteer services. So it's not enough detail in the audited financial statements around the notes to confirm the basis of those valuations. So I'll normally then come back to the NGO representative. Also, the AFS didn't submit the ACFID sort of code of conduct template for the financial services. So therefore, when that happens, then there's usually none of the figures in there around funds to international programs, program support, or community education, which are figures that come directly from that format. So I usually try to make sure it is a requirement as part of your code of conduct. So that should be sort of submitted. The other big one is usually around administration expenditure and whether NGOs have correctly taken out their ANCP component of administration expenditure from their DFAT funds. So with the change in the process now and the fact that we only record under 1A funds to international programs, if you receive a base grant of 150,000, therefore you have an allowable 15,000 of administration expenditure. If you fully spend all of that, then I would expect your funds to international programs to be 135,000, and that you're probably showing 15,000 in administration expenditure in your accounts. However, some NGOs are still deducting $150,000 under the 4A DFAT deduction. So they're forgetting to reduce that DFAT deduction by the administration component, which obviously, because it's not in that figure of 1A in the first place, needs to be taken out of a DFAT deduction. So in that case, our DFAT deduction should only be 135,000, and it matches or clears out our funds to international of the ANCP 135,000 that we sent. Hopefully that's clear. It's a lot different when it's much larger amounts and there's roll forwards to DFAT. So which is why I always encourage people to actually just submit a reconciliation as part of your working papers around that DFAT funds and the deducted component. Inclusion of ineligible projects, that's getting a lot better, and really in most cases now it's sort of welfare and the odd sort of religious activities. There are a few deductions from some NGOs, and normally it's been sort of well documented, but there are some where I know that historically there's been deductions. I will look at your last year's and prior year's RDE, and so often where there have been deductions in a specific area, I may query if there haven't been deductions in a similar category in the current year. And the last issue was around the contact of an appropriate RDE person who can talk to me around potential issues as well.
Okay, so we're really, I know we're pressing for time here, but we're in the last stages. So once the RDE submissions, have all been verified by Jeff, and we move through into calculating your grant agreements, the final step, I guess, on our side in terms of RDE is undertaking RDE spot checks. So up to 10 NGOs will be selected for a spot check in 2020. So not everyone here, but I guess we will be looking at 10. As the methodology in choosing NGOs for spot checks, not that it's changed so much, but there's just been the additional factor that as RDE is no longer looked at or covered at in accreditation, selection may also be based as to where you're sitting in your re-accreditation cycle. So if you're coming up for accreditation, that may be one of the factors why as to why you've been selected. So they're undertaken in June. Jeff or DFAT will give you a minimum of 10 days notice as to when Jeff will be looking to do it. It's a desk review followed by a one-day site visit. Jeff will then prepare a draft report, which will go back to the NGO within 5 days. The report will then come to DFAT within 15 days of the visit. And if you are selected for a spot check and you want to find out anything further on the process, there is terms of reference in the ANCP manual, but of course as well, Jeff or the ANCP team can answer any questions that you have. I don't know, Jeff, so just to quickly run through.
It's a relatively painless process as well, so just it's similar. Essentially, I'm looking to verify in a bit more detail, or not a bit more, more detail than just the desk review, the information that's been submitted in the RDE return. So I'll be looking to agree figures back to general ledger and supporting calculations, as we'll be looking at more detail around the nature of the volunteer services and the gifts. So at the desk review stage, that's normally I'm looking at the process that you've undertaken regarding identifying and submitting those, but I'm not usually looking in detail at the nature of all of the things like volunteer services and gifts. So in the spot check, we look into more detail around how the submission's been put together, the nature of the projects that have actually been included. So have there been any ineligible projects, e.g. scholarships? So how is the process around including the projects? So that's why I often request to understand what projects have been included in RDE, and we're looking for that distinction between development and non-development, and we're looking around the valuation. Yep. If we look at the type of errors that are normally sort of identify through that spot check process, 9 out of 10 times it's administration expenditure's been incorrectly included. In some cases, that's many NGOs allocate a component of administration expenditure as part of a normal allocation process, and that often ends up sitting within individual departments and in projects, program support. So those costs should be sort of taken out as part of the submission for your RDE return, but we'll often find that they're still included as part of the process. We're also looking at that segregation around the fundraising from the community education costs, and that's where we sort of referred to around that conservative approach. So if you've taken a conservative approach, you have a rationale around how you come up with the calculation, then that should be fine. But if it's a significant or a more aggressive allocation percentage, then it's more likely that there'll be an adjustment against your RDE as a result of that. And unavailability of key personnel. So spot checks are normally taken in either early June or sort of late, mid to late sort of May, as soon as we can, and depending around obviously end of year financial requirements as well from that perspective. So once we've identified the NGOs, then the ANCP will initiate sort of that initial communication that you've been selected. And then we can start the process around organising a time, not unlike what happens for accreditation as well. But if there are any constraints, feel free to sort of include that in your any initial response emails back to DFAT.
Yeah. All right, so that kind of brings us to the end here. So thanks to everyone who's managed to stay on for the full hour and a half. Hopefully it was really useful to everyone. We had some good questions throughout. So if anyone, we're always happy to answer final questions here. Or as you can see, we've got both the DFAT ANCP team contact details as well as Jeff, so PK Consolidated, his mobile and email. So please feel free to contact us anytime you have a question. Also the resources up here. So we've got the RDE explanatory notes. Again, I think that link is to the 2019 version. So if you need a copy, please feel free to email us. We've got the ANCP funding policy and the manual itself. Just a reminder, so ACFID will publish this webinar when it's finished. Just give them a few days, I guess, to pull it together, but they'll put it on their YouTube channel for you guys to read. Vicky will also send out the slides if you need to reference them for any reason. But again, as we said, contact us anytime if you have any questions. So that's it. Thanks so much. And thanks for ACFID and Vicky for pulling this together today. I hope it was really useful for everyone. And as Vicky mentioned at the beginning, if you wouldn't mind staying on just to complete a quick survey at the end to get feedback, that would be really useful.
Yeah, we welcome any suggestions as well for future webinars. Yeah. So thank you for your time and for your questions, and happy submitting.
Yep, good luck and hear from you guys soon.